Her father, Samuel Whitaker, drove a team of horses, his weather hand steady on the reins. Beside him, her younger brother, Thomas, no more than 15, scanned the horizon. Ellie admired their determination, her father's stubborn resilience, her brother's eagerness, but she couldn't shake the unease curling in her chest. Then she saw them, dust, rising on the horizon. Riders. A small cluster of figures moved swiftly through the golden haze, silhouettes against the dying sun. At first, Ellie thought they might be fellow settlers. Then she saw the gleam of rifles slung across their backs, the ragged, unkempt look of men who had spent too much time on the wrong side of civilization. Outlaws. A warning cry split the air from one of the lead wagons, and suddenly everything shattered into motion. Her father snapped the reins, urging the horses faster. The other settlers followed suit, voices rising in fear. Too late. The outlaws bore down on them like wolves upon a flock. Gunfire cracked through the evening stillness. A man in a wagon ahead of them slumped forward, his body tumbling to the ground. His wife's scream was swallowed by the roar of hooves. "Ellie, get down!" her father bellowed. She barely had time to react before Thomas grabbed her arm, yanking her into the depths of the wagon. Her heart pounded as bullets ripped through canvas, splinters flying from the wooden frame. The horses shrieked, rearing against their harnesses as chaos erupted. Ellie's father fired a shot, then another. She peered through a gap in the canvas and saw him, a man at the head of the outlaws, dressed in a long, dust-stained coat. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but even in the dim light, his grin was unmistakable. Caleb Briggs. She had heard whispers of his name in the last town they had passed. A killer, a thief, a man without mercy. Briggs raised his revolver and fired. Ellie's father jerked violently, a guttural sound escaping his lips as he crumpled onto the seat. The reins slipped from his hands. "No!" Ellie screamed. The wagon veered sharply as the horses lost direction. Thomas scrambled toward their father, reaching out, but a brutal jolt sent them both sprawling. Ellie barely had time to register the impact before strong hands wrenched her from the wreckage. She thrashed, kicked, tried to claw her way free, but the grip around her arms was ironclad. The world spun as she was hoisted onto a horse. Her body slammed against a broad chest. She twisted, gasping, only to find herself staring into Caleb Briggs' cold, calculating eyes. "Feisty," he mused, gripping her chin. "I like that." Ellie spat in his face. Briggs barked a laugh, wiping his cheek with the back of his glove. "You got fire in you, girl. That's good. You're going to need it." She fought again, but his grip tightened, pressing her close as he turned his horse away from the burning remains of the wagon train. Behind them, screams and gunshots still echoed. "Let me go," she demanded, her voice hoarse with fury. Briggs ignored her, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. "No can do. See, a woman like you? You're valuable. Ain't just any girl can fetch a good price." He smirked, feeling her tense. "Or maybe I keep you for myself. A little company never hurt." Revulsion clawed up her throat, but she bit down her fear. She would not give him the satisfaction. The outlaws rode deep into the wilderness, leaving destruction in their wake. The night swallowed them, the last flickering flames of the wagons fading behind. Ellie's arms ached from struggling, but she refused to go limp, refused to surrender. Her father was gone. She didn't know if Thomas had survived, but she was still breathing. And as long as she lived, she would find a way to escape. The outlaws slowed as they reached a narrow canyon, a hidden place away from prying eyes. The men dismounted, laughing, slapping each other on the back like victorious hunters. Ellie was dragged from the saddle, her legs barely holding her weight. Briggs shoved her forward. "Tie her up. I don't want any surprises." Rough hands bound her wrists, the rope cutting into her skin. She was pushed toward a tree at the edge of the camp and forced to sit. The men settled around a fire, drinking and dividing stolen goods. Ellie closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. Fear wouldn't save her. Panic wouldn't free her. She had to be smart, had to wait for the right moment. She shifted slightly, feeling the cool metal of a discarded knife half buried in the dirt beside her. Slowly, carefully, she edged her fingers toward it, Her heart hammered as she curled her fingers around the handle, working the blade toward her bindings. She didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. Briggs crouched beside her, his breath reeking of whiskey. His fingers closed over hers, yanking the knife away. "Tisk, tisk," he chided, gripping her wrist hard enough to make her wince. "That's a bad habit, girl." He twirled the knife between his fingers before tucking it into his belt. "But I like the spirit. Maybe I'll keep you after all." Ellie met his gaze, steel in her eyes. "I'd rather die." Briggs chuckled, standing. "Oh, sweetheart, you ain't got much choice." He walked away, leaving her bound and seething. The fire crackled, shadows dancing along the canyon walls. The outlaws' laughter carried through the night. Ellie's breath came in slow, measured draws. She wouldn't break, wouldn't cry, wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Above, clouds shifted, revealing a sliver of moonlight, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a pair of unseen eyes watched the camp, silent as a wind. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows along the canyon walls. Ellie sat rigid, her wrists raw from the coarse rope that bound them to the tree. The outlaws had grown careless, drunk on stolen whiskey and victory. Their laughter was loud, their movement sluggish. She studied them, memorizing each detail, searching for weakness. Somewhere in the darkness, her chance lurked. She just had to wait for it. A gust of wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it an eerie silence that hadn't been there before. The horses shifted uneasily, ears flicking. The fire crackled, sending embers drifting skyward. The men remained oblivious, but Ellie felt it, the shift in the air, the sense that something unseen moved beyond the firelight. Then it happened. A sharp whistle cut through the night. The closest outlaw barely had time to rise before an arrow buried itself deep in his throat. He gasped, eyes wide, hands clawing at the shaft. Another arrow struck before the others could react. A third man staggered backward. A tomahawk splintering through his rib cage before he collapsed. Panic erupted. The outlaws scrambled for their weapons, whiskey-fueled stupor turning into blind confusion. Ellie shrank against a tree, her pulse thundering. A shadow moved along the ridge, swift and precise, the blur of a figure slipping between the rocks. Gunfire erupted, but the shooter found no target. The unseen attacker struck again, dropping from above with deadly grace. Ellie caught a glimpse of him in the fire's glow, a man clad in buckskin, his face streaked with war paint, his long black hair bound with leather. A Comanche warrior. One outlaw lunged at him with a knife. The warrior sidestepped effortlessly, catching the man's wrist and twisting until bone snapped. The outlaw's scream barely escaped before the tomahawk found his throat. Caleb Briggs was already on his feet, revolver drawn. He fired into darkness, eyes wild. "Show yourself, you bastard." No answer. Silence. Ellie's breath came in short, shallow pulls. The outlaws were dead or dying. Only Briggs remained. He turned, gaze landing on her, jaw clenched in fury. He lunged, grabbing her by the arm and yanking her to her feet. "Come on," he snarled, dragging her toward the horses. "You're coming with me." He didn't make it 3 steps. A figure emerged from the blackness, swift as a specter. Briggs barely had time to raise his gun before the warrior struck, his blade flashing in the dim light. The revolver skittered to the ground. Ellie fell backward, gasping as Briggs staggered, a fresh wound slicing across his forearm. The two men faced each other, muscles coiled, eyes locked in unspoken challenge. Briggs, despite his bravado, knew he was outmatched. He took a step back, hand clutching his bleeding arm. "This ain't over," he spat. Then, without warning, he turned and bolted. Ellie sat frozen, her pulse roaring in her ears. The warrior watched Briggs disappear into the darkness but did not give chase. Instead, he turned to her. She stared up at him, every warning she had ever heard about men like him flashing in her mind. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face unreadable beneath the war paint. His dark eyes studied her, assessing. Her breath caught as he stepped closer. He knelt, and with a single flick of his knife, the ropes binding her wrists fell away. Ellie gasped, cradling her sore hands, glancing between him and the bodies scattered around the camp. He had slaughtered them all with terrifying efficiency. And yet she was still alive. He stood, looking down at her. His voice, when it came, was quiet, low. "You are free." She swallowed hard, unable to find words. Her wrist throbbed. Her heart pounded. Then she did something she never thought she would. She ran. Her feet barely touched the earth as she bolted, pushing past the bodies, past the smoldering fire, past the abandoned supplies. Her breath came in ragged gulps, lungs burning, mind screaming for her to keep going. She didn't make it far. The night was vast, the wilderness stretching endlessly in every direction. A few paces from camp, her knees buckled. She caught herself on trembling hands, the weight of exhaustion, fear, and grief slamming into her all at once. She couldn't go back. She had nowhere to go. Slowly, she turned her head. The warrior stood where she had left him, unmoving, watching. He made no move to stop her. He simply waited. Ellie's breath shuddered. She wiped at the tears she hadn't realized were there. Her father was dead. Her brother, she didn't know. She had nothing, and yet she was still breathing. For several moments, neither of them moved. Then, finally, he lifted his chin. "You will not survive alone." She knew he was right. She hated that he was right. Ellie pushed herself to her feet, swallowing the last remnants of her pride. She took a step back toward him. His expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes shifted. He turned without another word and walked toward the horses. Ellie followed. The night swallowed them both. The silence between them stretched long and unbroken, filled only by the distant cry of a coyote and the rustle of the wind through the sparse brush. Ellie followed the Comanche warrior through the wilderness, her steps unsteady but determined. He had not spoken since they left the outlaw camp, nor had he looked back to see if she was keeping up. He moved like a shadow, effortless and sure, his presence as much a part of the land as the rocks and the wind. Ellie's throat was dry, her body aching from days of captivity. Her hands, still raw from the ropes, trembled with exhaustion. She was alive, free from the outlaws, but the reality of her situation pressed down on her. She was alone with a man she did not know, in a land that did not forgive weakness. And yet, she had chosen to follow him. The warrior suddenly halted. Ellie nearly stumbled into him. Without a word, he gestured to the darkness ahead. At first, she saw nothing. Then she noticed a faint shimmer of water reflecting moonlight, a small creek winding through the valley. He knelt at its edge, cupped his hands, and drank. Ellie hesitated before lowering herself to her knees. She scooped up the water and brought it to her lips, gasping at the icy shock against her parched throat. She drank greedily, her body sighing in relief. When she glanced at him, he was watching. His gaze was not unkind, but neither was it welcoming. It was unreadable, as if he were weighing something about her, considering. "Thank you," she murmured. The words felt small, insignificant against all that had happened. He gave no answer. Instead, he rose and walked toward the horses. Ellie pushed herself up, wiping her damp hands on her tattered skirts. She watched as he checked the saddle on his mount, then turned to face her fully for the first time. "Ride or walk," he said, his voice deep, measured. Ellie blinked. It was the first choice she had been given in days. She glanced at the horse, at its dark, steady eyes, then back at him. Every muscle in her body begged for rest, but her pride kept her from surrendering too easily. "I'll walk," she said, lifting her chin. He gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, and started forward. Ellie followed. The night stretched into morning. The first golden light of dawn found them traversing a rocky incline, the air cool and crisp. Ellie's legs screamed in protest, her exhaustion a dull throb behind her ribs. She wanted to ask where they were going, how much farther, but something about his silence made her bite back the words. Finally, when the sun had fully risen, he stopped. A plateau stretched before them, scattered with low shrubs and tall grasses swaying in the breeze. A lone tree stood near the edge of a drop-off, overlooking the valley below. He gestured toward it. "Rest." Ellie didn't argue. She dropped beside the tree, hugging her knees as she caught her breath. He unfastened a small leather pouch from his belt and tossed it to her. She barely caught it in time. Inside, She found strips of dried meat. She looked up at him in surprise. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer right away. He crouched a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Then finally he spoke, because they were evil. The words were simple, final. Ellie studied him, truly seeing him for the first time. He was not much older than she was, perhaps mid-20s, his skin bronzed by the sun, his hair long and black. His eyes held a depth she could not name, something ancient, something knowing. She took a small bite of the dried meat, chewing slowly. "What's your name?" He hesitated. Then quietly, "Tahu." She let the name settle on her tongue. "Tahu," she repeated. He glanced at her, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. The day passed in slow, quiet intervals. Tahu showed her how to gather water from plants, how to read the shifting winds for signs of rain. He moved like a man who understood the land in ways she never could, his every action deliberate, every step placed with purpose. As the sun began to lower, they stopped near a sheltered grove. Tahu started a small fire, the glow casting flickering light across his face. Ellie sat across from him, warming her hands. "You do not trust me," he said, breaking the silence. Ellie stiffened. She hadn't expected him to say it so plainly. "I don't know you," she admitted. "I don't know where you're taking me." Tahu considered this. Then he reached down, drawing a line in the dirt between them. "You come from that world," he said, pointing past the line. Then he tapped the earth on his side. "I come from this one." He met her eyes. Trust does not live in between. Ellie swallowed. She knew what he meant. They were from different worlds, different lives. But they were here now, walking the same path, bound together by fate or circumstance. "Where are we going?" she asked. Tahu poked at the fire with a stick. "Away." She frowned. "Away from what?" His gaze lifted, scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. "Men who are still hunting you." Ellie's stomach twisted. "Caleb." She clenched her hands, staring into the fire. The warmth did nothing to chase away the cold fear creeping into her bones. Tahu watched her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he reached into the pouch at his belt and pulled something free. He extended it toward her. Ellie hesitated before taking it. A knife, small but sharp. "For what?" she whispered. His voice was steady. "To fight." Ellie looked up at him, searching his face. He did not offer comfort, did not offer empty reassurances. He offered something else. A choice. She tightened her grip on the knife. The fire crackled between them, the only sound in the vast emptiness of the land. Ellie did not sleep that night. Neither did Tahu. Morning would come soon, and with it, the men who would stop at nothing to reclaim what they had lost. Dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of amber and rose. But the beauty of it was lost on Ellie. She gripped the knife Tahu had given her, its hilt rough against her palm. Fear coiled deep in her gut, but she forced herself to breathe, to steady her hands. She had known this moment would come. She had seen it in Tahu's eyes last night, the understanding that the men hunting her would not stop. And now they were here. The dust on the horizon rose in thin plumes, barely visible against the morning light. But Ellie knew what it meant. Riders. Caleb Briggs had found them. Tahu was already on his feet, crouched near the edge of the plateau, scanning the valley below. His expression was unreadable, but his body was taut, muscles coiled like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. He turned to her, his voice low, even. "They come." Ellie swallowed hard and nodded. She knew running was pointless. Caleb wouldn't stop hunting her. If they fled now, he would only chase them down again. No, it had to end here. Tahu moved with quiet precision, gathering his bow, his quiver, his tomahawk. He handed her a small pouch, and when she opened it, she found dried powder inside, black ash. "For your face," he murmured, "to hide your fear." Ellie hesitated before dabbing 2 fingers into the powder and swiping it beneath her eyes. It felt like war paint. She wasn't a warrior, not like him, but she could fight. She had to. The first shots rang out before the riders even crested the hill. Tahu was already moving, loosing an arrow into the approaching figures. A scream followed, and a man tumbled from his horse. But Caleb's men kept coming, a ruthless tide of dust and gunfire. Ellie ducked behind the rocks as bullets tore through the air, splintering stone. Her heart pounded, but she refused to let terror paralyze her. She gripped her knife tighter and looked to Tahu. He was a force of nature. He moved with deadly efficiency, his arrows finding their marks with unerring precision. When the bow was empty, he switched to his tomahawk, striking with brutal speed. He was outnumbered, but he did not falter. Caleb dismounted with a slow, deliberate ease, his revolver gleaming in the morning light. His lips curled into a sneer. "You really thought you could run from me, girl?" His voice was thick with amusement, with certainty. "You and your redskin here made this a whole lot harder on yourselves." Ellie stepped from the rocks before she could think better of it. "I'm not afraid of you." Caleb's smirk widened. "That's so." He took a slow step toward her, his revolver swinging at his side. "Tell me, girl, you think this savage is going to save you? That he gives a damn about what happens to you?" His gaze flicked to Tahu. "He's just waiting for his chance, same as the rest of them." Ellie's fingers clenched around the knife. "You don't know anything about him." Caleb chuckled. "I know men like him don't get to keep women like you." Ellie barely saw Tahu move. 1 second he was still. The next he was a blur, lunging at Caleb with the speed of a striking serpent. The two men collided hard, sending Caleb's revolver skidding across the ground. Ellie staggered back as the fight erupted before her, vicious and unrelenting. Tahu was fast, but Caleb was ruthless, fighting like a man who had learned to survive through sheer brutality. He struck hard, his fists landing with sickening force. Tahu countered, his movements fluid, but Ellie saw the exhaustion in his limbs, the days without rest, the wounds from their journey. He was running on sheer will alone. Caleb caught Tahu off guard, landing a heavy blow to his ribs before shoving him backward. Tahu hit the ground hard, dust billowing around him. Ellie didn't think. She acted. She lunged to the revolver, her fingers curling around the grip. Caleb turned just as she raised it, his expression darkening. "You won't shoot me," he said, voice thick with certainty. "You ain't got it in you." Ellie's breath came in shallow, unsteady pulls. Her hands trembled. She had never killed a man. She didn't know if she could. Then she saw Tahu, struggling to rise, blood at the corner of his mouth. And she knew. Her hand steadied. She pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked through the air, echoing across the valley. Caleb staggered, his hand pressing to his side where the bullet had found him. His eyes flickered with something like disbelief before his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed onto his knees, a gurgling sound escaping his lips. Ellie took a step forward, the revolver still raised. She watched as the light drained from his eyes, as his breath rattled in his chest one final time. Then he was still. Silence settled over the battlefield. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader dead, turned tail and rode hard into distance, disappearing over the horizon. Ellie let the revolver slip from her grasp. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Tahu had not caught her. His grip was firm, steady. "You are not weak," he murmured. Ellie swallowed, looking up at him. His face was streaked with dirt and blood, but his eyes were warm, steady. She realized then that she had never been safer than she was at this moment, standing beside him. Her fingers curled around his wrist, her breath unsteady. "I—" The word stuck in her throat. There was too much to say, and yet not enough. Tahu's hand brushed against her cheek, the touch feather-light. For the first time since she had met him, his expression softened, his guard slipping just enough for her to see past it. There was something unspoken in his gaze, something fragile yet unbreakable. She felt the pull between them, undeniable, inevitable. And then, just as quickly, he stepped back. His voice was quiet when he spoke. "Your people are west. You must go." Ellie's heart clenched. "And you?" Tahu looked past her toward the horizon. "My path is not yours." She searched his face, her throat tightening. She wanted to tell him she didn't care about paths or differences, that she wanted to stay. But the words never left her lips. She saw the truth in his eyes. He was letting her go. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the wild, the vastness of the land stretching endless before them. Ellie took a shaky breath, nodding. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. She did not look back. She did not have to. She knew he was watching. And she knew, somewhere out there, their paths would cross again.